This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Welcome to Software Engineering Radio. I'm your host, Gavin Henry, and today my guest is Dave Thomas. Dave Thomas has been consulting and programming for 50 years and still writes code almost every day. He's an author of the Pragmatic Programmer, one of my personal favorites, especially the 20th edition, the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, Programming Ruby, Agile Web Development with Rails, Programming Elixir, and I'm not finished yet, and more recently, Simplicity. He currently runs the Pragmatic Bookshelf, and in his spare time, he is looking at better ways of writing OO code, as in, what does that stand for?
Object-oriented.
Of course. Dave, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being here. It's great to chat.
Is there anything missed in that impressive bio of yours, or are you happy with it?
Well, not really. I mean, I do a lot of random stuff, basically. My wife accuses me of just doing the stuff I'm interested in, which is probably true. And
that's all right.
I'm a bit of a magpie when it comes to the things I'm interested in. So I'm never quite sure what I'm going to be attacking on a particular day or month.
That's a great way to live. I like it. So before we start, I'll mention a small disclaimer. I'm pretty close to finishing a book I'm writing for your company, the Pragmatic Bookshelf, about Rust and C. So I actually know how some of this stuff works from the author's perspective. So I just thought I'd say
and
that.
What are you doing talking to me and not finishing the book off, huh?
Well, private commitments. I was doing it this morning, don't worry.
Oh, good.
Anyway, let's begin. So the show is called Building eBooks Infrastructure. So we need to lay the foundation. So I'd like to start with an overview of what an ebook is.
So an ebook is fundamentally just the text of a book in some kind of accessible format to electronics. In the old days, which was 15, 20 years ago, there were probably half a dozen different standards for what made an ebook. But nowadays, we've pretty much settled on a format called ePub. And ePub is actually, I mean, if you have an ePub file, you can actually just run unzip on it. And if you unzip an ePub, you'll find that it's a bunch of HTML, a bunch of assets, and then a couple of manifest type files that give it navigation and metadata and all that kind of stuff. So whenever you feed an ebook into your reader, whether that's a Kindle or a Apple Books or whatever it might be, all it's doing really is unzipping that and then running some kind of browser clone to actually display the content.
You mentioned there used to be other formats. I remember always having to send a .mobi file. Mm-hmm. I think you can still download those when you buy a book from you.
No, Amazon has stopped distributing Mobis, I believe.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I may be wrong about that. Because now, in the old days, you're right, we had to give Amazon a Mobi file. And that was always a real pain because Mobis were different in terms of the stuff that they would support to regular ePubs. So getting compatible files between Mobis and ePubs was always a challenge. But eventually Amazon gave in and switched across. So now we submit ePubs to them. And internally, they do change them into something for the Kindle. I don't know exactly how they do that. For all I know, it may well be Mobi still. But yeah, we never now see a Mobi file.
And was that mainly because ePub was a standard or is a standard and Mobi wasn't?
Yeah, I think they were constantly playing catch up with the ePub. And frankly, it just wasn't worth it because I think initially they went Mobi because it gave them the ability to control stuff a bit better on the Kindle. But eventually, ePub does everything Mobi does plus a lot more. It's a way more flexible format. And so I think they just said, well, why are we fighting a technology war that we don't really get any benefit from? So they just switched across.
Did they give you any help to render and produce them?
We didn't have to do anything. We were always generating Mobis and ePubs as part of our process. And so we just basically stopped sending them Mobis.
Ah, I see. And was there a big difference? It seems to be that they were playing catch up, you said.
I mean, from our point of view, not at all. From a consumer point of view, I honestly don't know. My guess would be over the years, yes, I think it has improved. So, for example, when you first started generating Mobis, they did not support the equivalent of the pre-tag, which is the thing that says, do not change the spacing. And that meant that code listings were always very, very challenging. So for a while, we were actually converting code into images and then embedding the images in the ePub because it was the only way we could find to reliably get them to render. There was a whole bunch of stuff like that where Mobi's they were designed for reading fiction, basically. There was a Kindle. It's your ticket to the beach and read a book device. And so anything that we needed that was a little bit out of the norm, we would have to fake out using a whole bunch of tables or a whole bunch of images or something like that. And now we don't bother. Now we just use ePub. And ePubs are gradually getting closer and closer to the browser. So we get richer and richer formatting as we go forward.
Yeah, I think I remember having to double tap a code listing because it was just a big image and then you'd have to zoom around and it was pretty painful.
And that was painful for you as a reader and also painful for us as a publisher. And we were constantly bumping into various limits and things like what happens if a code listing is bigger than a page and that kind of thing.
And did they differ in, I guess the Mobis would have been bigger in file size because you were putting images in them rather than?
I think they probably were, yeah. Initially, we started out trying to keep all of them below about 2 meg because I can't remember, there was some arbitrary limit someone had. But nowadays, that's not a problem. So we don't have to worry about it.
And just to clarify before we move on, is a PDF an ebook?
I guess it could be. To my mind, an ebook is something which is convenient to read electronically. PDFs are certainly readable electronically. The question is, are they convenient? One of the distinguishing factors, I think, is whether or not it's reflowable. Now, that means that when I take a browser, right, if you bring a browser window up and look at a web page, if you change the size of the browser window, the text grows or shrinks or expands or whatever to fill the space. And you don't have to paginate it. You don't get down to the bottom of one page. And then, if you're reading an article, hit some magic key and then the whole screen clears and the next page comes up. So that's a kind of fixed format, and PDF is a fixed format. It's page-based. Whereas typically for the kind of books that we're creating and for typical fiction and everything else, you don't want that. Instead, you want it to be flow-based, which means that as I change the size of the screen or I change the font, then the layout of the text adjusts to suit that.
Would the PDF reader not do that for you, or would that just be?
They kind of can now. You can actually tell it to turn off pagination and do that kind of reflowing. It messes it up more than it gets it right. And the reason for that is that the PDF format internally, it doesn't really consist of a whole bunch of text with instructions around it. The text is broken up into very, very small chunks and then positioned on the page as a small chunk of text. And so in order to reflow it, what you've really got to do is basically analyze that text and try to work out, well, this is a paragraph, because you don't know. It's not anything intrinsic in a PDF to say this is a paragraph. So it's tricky to reflow, and they do it, and hats off to them for doing it, but it's not perfect.
Well, I did a show with Peter Wyatt and Duff Johnson on the 30 years of PDF, because they helped do all the spec and everything in there. We did a deep dive on it all, if listeners want to pick up show 532.
Well, I'm going to go listen to that. That's interesting.
We speak about the biggest PDF in the world that covers the whole city of Japan and all sorts of really cool stuff.
Mm.
Right, so I think you were hinting at this, but do you think books are evolving toward more like a website where you can get a book updated over time, either get it corrected or changed?
Well, our books have always been like that. If you buy an ebook from us, then we will actually send you updates. And either if we find bugs, sometimes if the author does like a revision, typically not for like a second edition, because that's typically a rewrite. But if an author wants to do like a third or fourth printing and they discover they want to add another couple of paragraphs, we just throw those in there and distribute it. And so you get a notification, you download the most recent one, and you have it. Remember that ebooks are typically designed to be read offline. They may not be, but they're designed that way. And so we can't just magically update it in your reader. And in fact, you wouldn't want to. Quite often, readers don't want you to do that because they'll be making annotations or whatever in the existing one. So we make them always available. In a way, I think the biggest thing I'm seeing, though, is that we're getting more adventurous in what we can do inside a book. So it's actually, not many people know this, but you have disclosure lists in HTML where you can have a heading and you click on it and then the text below it expands and you get a whole bunch of backup material for that.
Yeah, like I think in the JavaScript sort of widget world, they call them accordions, don't they?
Accordions, yeah. But in fact, that's built into HTML.
Okay.
It doesn't have to have any JavaScript running at all. And a lot of ebook readers actually support that. And way back when, we actually experimented with putting that into our ebooks. So you could actually have like a summary list, which if you clicked on a particular link, that would expand to show you the detail. And at the time, we ran into the problem that because most ebook readers back then were e-ink displays, then it basically had to clear the screen and redraw it with the expanded text. And people just found that too distracting. But that's an example of the kind of thing that you can do in an ebook that you can't do in most other book style output, and certainly not in paper.
Yeah, it sounds like you could enrich the page more and keep relevant text, but not immediately present it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of do that with footnotes now in our ePubs. A footnote is a link, and you tap the link and it goes to the footnote. And then on the footnote, you tap another link and it takes you back to where you were in the text. And yeah, that kind of thing is definitely possible. One of the things that we have discovered, though, is that one of the attributes of a book is that it is kind of, boring in terms of the way it's laid out and everything else. You know what to expect when you have a book. And so if you were reading a book and it suddenly went all psychedelic on you or all the fonts changed or something, that would be really distracting. And a book is not supposed to be a distraction. A book is simply a substrate where an author can get content to a reader. And once you start making it all gee whiz, look at the technology, you kind of get in the way of that communication. That breaks my heart because I love experimenting with the kind of wild stuff you can do inside an ePub. But it's just too risky, to be honest with you, to do that. People will complain if you do that.
Yeah, it's a sort of medium to disappear into, isn't it? And
exactly right.
Keep clean and no distractions, unlike the rest of the world.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the last thing you want is a pop-up ad in an ebook.
I think they would try if they...
I mean, you can do it. You can actually do it. But yeah, that would be disastrous.
Cool. So I'm going to take us on to the middle part of our chat today. So now that we know what an ebook is and the formats that you support as a publisher, and pretty much everyone supports, which is ePub, like you said, let's talk about building them.
Okay.
So building ePubs. First question, what do authors write books in? Word?
No. And that's actually, you know what? It may be easier to do this slightly differently and go back and look at the history.
Go for it.
Because that actually informs a lot of what we do. So the whole book business started in 1997, I guess, when Andy Hunt and I started putting together the Pragmatic Programmer. Except we weren't doing the Pragmatic Programmer at the time. We were just doing a set of notes that we could give our clients, because we would turn up at a client. We were doing consulting at the time. We'd turn up at a client and we'd always spend the first couple of days saying the same things to every client. Stuff like, maybe you want to test that before you ship it, or can you build this automatically, and all that kind of pretty obvious stuff. But at the time, it wasn't obvious. So we put together some notes, and they were just HTML pages that we were going to print out. And it was actually my wife who said, why don't you see if you can get a publisher interested in that, because it's good stuff. And so we thought, well, no, there's no way people would be interested in that as a book. But we came up with this cunning plan, which was we would submit it to who we thought was the best publisher for this kind of material, and they would reject it. But when they rejected it, they would say why they rejected it, and that would help us to make it better. So we submitted it to Addison Wesley, and they screwed us over by accepting it. And so we were stuck with having to produce this book. And we already had a whole bunch of content. Andy and I are really strong believers in the power of plain text. So text that has basically just words, just characters. So we'd never, ever used word processors to do anything. Back then, 1997, 98, that was basically Microsoft Word. And Word has got better, but Word does not produce the kind of quality layout that you need for a book. So back then, if you were an author, the chances were pretty good. You would be authoring in Microsoft Word, and you would submit your book to your publisher. And the publisher would take your Word document and they would import it into their own layout software. And that might be something like FrameMaker. Nowadays, it would be InDesign, whatever it might be. And that's a one-way process. They ingest it, it gets into their tool. And at that point, the master copy of the book is in their hands, and they do whatever they have to do to make it look good. So now I'm an author, and I have discovered an error in the book, and I want to fix it. Well, I cannot fix the Word document anymore because that's now irrelevant. It's not anything to do with the book anymore. So what I have to do is to basically send my changes to the publisher as a set of, on page 27, line 4, change the word this to that. And then some poor person at the other end has to go through, read those instructions, bring up the FrameMaker, and make whatever the adjustment is. And to us, that just felt like this impossible. We're never going to do that. So we convinced Addison Wesley to let us give them a camera-ready PDF. Actually, no, it was a PostScript file at the time. And we asked them for their spec, and they gave us their spec for typesetting. And then we set about putting together a toolchain that would let us write plain text and have it end up being a book. And we went through a couple of iterations. The first one, we used a tool called Troff, T-ROF. That's T-R-O-F-F. And Troff was, at that point, easily 20 years old. It was part of the Unix Documenters Workbench that came out of Bell Labs. And in Troff, what you did is you basically typed your text, and then you inserted various formatting instructions by basically, you would start a line with a period, a full stop, and then you would put like a 1 or 2 character instruction, like this is a title, or this is a page break or something. And it would then take your text and format it using those instructions.
Kind of like HTML almost with your title.
Kind of like HTML, way more restricted, but way more specialized. But the thing that made it usable is that it had a macro system. So you could define commands using the lower level commands. So we produced this library that would do the layout, and it kind of worked, but Troff was written for academic papers. It wasn't written for book type stuff. And a lot of people have written the books in Troff, but honestly, it doesn't do a very good job of paragraph breaking, where it decides where to put a new line in a paragraph. It just looks a bit ugly. So we switched across to using Tech, which was Don Knuth's layout system, which makes way, way nicer output. And so we produced a set, or I produced a set of LaTeX macros to define the book. And we wrote the book in LaTeX. And we delivered the PDFs to Addison Wesley, and to our surprise, they just said, yep, that's good. So the first edition of Pragmatic Programmer was produced that way. But the nice thing was, I think the first edition, I can't remember how many printings we had. It was a lot. And they would come to us and say, any changes you want to make? And we actually had the ability just to go through the book and update stuff and then regenerate the PDF and send it to them. It was kind of interesting at the time. What happened was you would send them the PDF. They would run it through something called a RIP, which converts it into a high-resolution set of images. And then they would burn those images onto metal plates. And those metal plates would then go into the printing presses. And you've probably seen the things on TV of these massive big machines with big drums that are spinning, and paper flies through, goes in white, comes out with text on it. So there's actually a decent cost associated with converting a PDF into those metal plates. So what they tried to do is to reuse plates that haven't changed. And so we had to come up with a system where we could automatically tell them which pages had changed and which pages hadn't to reduce their costs. But that was fun.
And that was groundbreaking for that time.
I don't know, maybe. I don't know. Here's the thing. We didn't know what we were doing. We were just doing what sounded like a good idea at the time. And so we were experimenting and we're just doing what we thought was a good idea.
So thanks for the history of how you got started in text. So that answers our question if things are written in Word or not. I guess other publishers might write in Word.
In technical publishing, that used to be the case. Nowadays, some don't. Some still do take Word. But Word, it just seems like such a crazy thing. It's really not suited for writing books. Added to which, if you've ever tried writing a 500-page Word document, it doesn't like that at all. Right? It bogs down and it's pretty ugly.
So when you write a book for the Pragmatic Programmer, does an author use like a what you see is what you get editor, or what is the actual text format?
No. So in the intermediate days, we switched from using LaTeX to using an XML-based markup. Basically, it was a simplified HTML. And so you would write in this HTML thing. We called it PML for Pragmatic Markup Language. And it was a semantic markup. So you would have tags for here's some code, here's a sidebar, whatever it might be. And that's what you would write. And authors had the ability then to be able to run our toolchain on their local computer and generate either a PDF or an ePub. And they could then look at their output that way. So the answer is no, they don't write in a WYSWYG format. And there's two reasons for that. First of all, I always liked there was a quote from Brian Kernighan who said, WYSWYG really should be WYSWYG. It's what you see is all you get. So there's no additional semantic information in there. And we wanted to have that extra content. But secondly, if you give an author a tool that lets them generate a WYSWYG tool, then what they tend to do is focus on that layout. And they'll spend a long time twiddling with margins and fonts and everything else. And that's not what we want. What we want is authors to focus on their content because we have people that do the layout. And so it's actually, I think, a benefit not to be able to see the actual laid out text as you're typing it. So in the old days, we used to have an XML-based layout called PML, and authors would write in this PML, and then the toolchain would convert that into PDFs or eBooks or whatever. We have moved across to using Markdown as our input, and it's a work in progress. We started off by allowing people to embed Markdown inside their PML documents. And in the last year or so, we now encourage authors to write in .md files, in Markdown files. And you can still use your old PML tags inside that Markdown if you want to, but we're basically slowly moving to the point where you no longer have to. And so we actually have a Markdown that's rich enough to let you express everything you need to do, not just as an author of a book, but also as a publisher of a book, because there's lots of little small subtle things we have to do in the background to control the process a bit.
So has Markdown evolved since you created PML?
Markdown didn't even exist when we started creating PML, I don't think. Back then it was Textile was the equivalent of Markdown. So yeah, Markdown has, well, first of all, it's become the de facto plain text writing language. But also over the years, the practicality of Markdown has expanded. And for example, the ability to embed HTML inside Markdown in a kind of rational way means that you don't have to be limited by just the few things that Markdown can do. And a consensus is being gradually reached on how you write extensions for Markdown. And so that we can add extra facilities to our Markdown in a kind of consistent way. So yeah, Markdown has matured a lot. And like I say, it's what I write all my books in now.
I want to ask a few technical questions about how you handle Markdown then.
Sure.
How are errors? So you've got your own toolchain that you've written that I don't know if it's still bits of it from when you originally did it in the 90s.
Yeah.
So how do you handle errors in that raw format?
As well as we can. So let me talk to you about how the toolchain actually works. So what we have is a pipeline. So at one end of it, you have a set of Markdown files. And one of those Markdown files will be called book.md. And it will typically include all of the different Markdown files that make up your book. We encourage authors to do at least a separate chapter per file. Some authors actually have each section as a file or whatever, it doesn't really matter. So you feed that Markdown top-level file into a pipeline, and the pipeline goes through, it's a variable number depending on the author and the book, but at least half a dozen different pre-processes. The first one is the one that goes through and takes that book.pml, and it goes through and looks for all these inclusions and replaces them with the actual contents of the files. And that produces a stream of text that no longer has includes in it. That stream gets passed to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. At some point in that process, we convert the Markdown into XML. And not coincidentally, the XML we convert it into is actually our original PML format. And the reason for that is that we have tens of thousands of lines of code that know how to handle that PML format to generate books in PDF, Mobi, ePub, whatever formats. And so by using that as our intermediate target, we can reuse a whole bunch of our tooling as we go forward. It also means that we can do a more gradual switch over to Markdown because authors can still embed PML markup in their Markdown documents. And that just makes it all the way through the various stages in the pipeline until it gets to the PML converter. So if we're targeting an ebook, what we have to do is convert your PML into XHTML, a 1999 standard. If we're converting it to a PDF, then what we actually do is we convert it in a couple of steps, which I'll talk about in a minute. And to do that conversion from one format of XML to HTML, we use a fantastic technology called XSLT, which is a way of specifying a set of transforms that you apply to an XML document, which sounds terribly, terribly technical. But all it really means is you give it a set of rules. You say to it, whenever you see a code tag, for example, replace it with a pre, and then whatever the content of that code tag is. And so you actually write this very functional style set of templates that translate your XML into whatever format you want. So for the ebooks, that's all we do. We have some XSLT that takes the input document and generates literally all of the files that are necessary to create, say, an ePub. So we're generating it's not even chapters. We have to break the book down into chunks because ePub readers need each section to be no longer than, 3 or 4 pages. You can't have like an entire book in a single chunk. So we break it into chunks. We set them out to separate files. We do all the cross-referencing. We generate the manifests. All of that stuff is done in XSL. The only additional code that we have is the code that normalizes our images. Some ebook readers insist that you only give them black and white images, for example, so we have to convert those. If we are generating PDFs, we go through a similar path but with a different outcome. We still use XSLT, but then what we do is we generate another XML format, which is called XSL:FO. And the FO stands for formatting objects. And FO is, frankly, I'm amazed it works because what it takes on is incredibly complicated. It's basically a way of describing text laid out in 2 dimensions. And it's also a way of describing the structure of a book so that the book effectively is a container for the text that it's creating. It is still, to me, a miracle that it actually works, but it does. And it produces gorgeous-looking PDFs. So that is the essence of the toolchain. It runs, like I say, as a pipeline, and the pipeline varies per book because different authors have different things they want to be able to do. So, for example, some authors want to be able to include mathematical equations in their books, and we have a preprocessor that will do that. But if you don't have math in your book, there is no point in slowing down the build by including that preprocessor. So those kind of things are optional. So in total, we probably have, 12 20 different preprocessors that people...
Is that something the author needs to pick to preprocess, or is that detected at the start?
When you sign up, you get to check out your repository, and that's preloaded with the ones that just about everybody uses. And then your editor will say, you'll say to the editor, gosh, I really wish I could do an equation here. And they'll go, oh, okay, that's easy. And they'll show you how to do that by adding whatever the preprocessor is to make it happen.
I see. And if it does, getting back to the question, was how are errors handled, I guess.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. So the problem we had there is it's exactly the same as a compiler or something. And that is, by the time you're sort of 6 or 7 levels deep in preprocessors, you've lost all of the original information about where you were in the input document. And so what we do, and it's not perfect, but when the includer runs, the first thing it does is it adds XML comments to the stream every time it includes a file. And that includes the file name and a bit of other information. And then every preprocessor that changes the text as it goes through will flag the start and end of that change with another comment to say, I am at the relative line 27 into the current chunk. And so at some point, if you get an error, what it then does is it goes back through that kind of stack of location things to work out where you actually were in the original document. And it tries to report it. Typically, it can get it within a few lines, unless you're looking at a really, really long run of text, in which case you may be off like a dozen lines because there's none of these little flags to try to record where you were in the original. So it's definitely a problem, and it's something I'm working on refining always, but it's getting better than it was.
And you've already answered one of my questions, which was going to be about equations. So that'll be enabled at the start manually, whether you're going to do LaTeX or something like that.
Right.
How are links and references handled within the book?
So that is actually an ongoing question, because if you think about it, if you're in a PDF, then imagine you're just reading on paper. There's no hyperlinks. You can't press on the paper and it tunes the page for you. So when you do a cross-reference in a paper book, what you have to do is say, as you can see in the section on, editing a file on page 27, you do this. So a cross-reference there is basically a verbose description of where you're pointing to. If it's a ebook, then the same thing can just be a hyperlink, and you click on it and it takes you there. And what we wanted was a single markup that would let you express both of those. And we're very close. There's some cases where it's not going to work, but 99% of the time, what you do is you say, whenever you have a destination, somewhere you want to point to, you tag it, you give it an ID, and then in the body of the book, you can say cross-reference to this target. And if it is an ebook, it will generate a hyperlink for that. If it's a paper book, it will go and have a look at that target and find a good name for it. So if it's a section, it will say the section named and then the title. If it's a diagram, it will give you the figure number. If it's a line of code, it will actually give you, line 27 of the code or whatever. And so it will expand your cross-reference into a textual description, just as if it was a real paper book.
And you already mentioned, I think, how people can handle code embedding or formatting. So code would be a code tag in your PML, you said.
Yeah, in PML, it's a code tag. In Markdown, it's just a Markdown fenced block. And you put the language after the fence.
What's the backtick things, isn't it?
In the backticks or tildes, yeah. And so it will take that and it will do syntax highlighting on it and then generate whatever is necessary to format that either for the ebook or for the PDF. The PDF, typically, we syntax highlight to black and white, but we actually also have books that are in color, printed in color, in which case the syntax highlighting survives as different colors. But we also have markup inside the code where our toolchain is aware of all the different languages and it knows about what constitutes a comment in each of those different languages. So if it was C, for example, it would be a block with a /* and then some text and //. If it was Ruby, it would be a pound character, a hash character. and it looks for markup inside comments to make it do things. So that's where I could do things like say, this is a destination. I want to put an ID on this line of code. And then in the body of the text, you can say, as you can see on, and then reference that ID, and it will say line 27 or whatever of the code. It's also how we do highlighting of or calling out particular lines of code. So quite often authors want to show which lines changed as they're running through an example. And so we have this markup where you can say, start emphasizing this code and then end. And it will actually put little arrows in the margin to show you that. And then finally, the really important thing is in the old days, what you would do is you would take the code that you wanted to describe and then cut and paste it into the inline text of the book. And the problem with that is that if you then went through and updated the code, how would you know that you'd correctly updated everything in the book as well? Because a particular chunk of code might occur on 6 different pages in the book as you're building up an example, say. So what we wanted to do is to encourage authors not to put code in line in the text of their book, but to keep code as code in program source files. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that is so that they can actually test that code as part of the book building process. So, for example, in my Ruby book, every single example of code in that book is actually run every time the book is built, and it verifies that the output hasn't changed. So that if, for example, they make some change to Ruby and one of my examples no longer works, the book won't build, and it'll tell me that that's changed. So to make that work, you typically don't want every code example to have all of the code. You just want to highlight one particular section as you're talking about it. So one of the markups we can have in code is the ability to define regions of that code, sections of that code, and give them a name. And then when you include the code in your book, you say, include from this file the sections named this, this, and this. And it will just include those lines into the book.
You mentioned already that authors can build the book locally. So I guess the whole tool chain's fairly smallish and you can get it all set up locally.
It can be.
I was just wondering about your sort of the integration testing there of your own code. That's something extra you do locally.
Yeah, that takes a little bit of work, but it's not onerous.
Okay.
Like all of our editors, for example, most of our editors are English majors, and most of them are set up to be able to build on their own machines. One of the joys of my life is when an editor whose prior taste of computing was using Microsoft Windows and Word gets online and said, I tried to set that environment variable and it didn't work. It's kind of fun just that I'm corrupting a whole generation of editors there. But yeah, setting the toolchain up typically involves, you have a version control tool. We currently use Subversion for historical reasons. So you would check out your repository, and that gives you a whole bunch of stuff, which is kind of like the boilerplate, but it gives you all of our toolchain as well. And so given the repository, all you have to do typically is install a version of Java, and that's because tools that do our XSLFO processing are Java-based. So we took the advantage of having Java lying around, and everything else we've got is based off that Java runtime. The tools are not written in Java, they're written in Ruby, but we run jRuby, which is a version of Ruby that runs inside the JVM. And that lets us, basically you have one dependency, which is this Java, and then the rest just typically kind of works.
So you obviously write your own tools for this because there was nothing before. Authors can build everything locally. If you wanted, you can put a bit more work in and do all your code examples. And just for the listeners, for myself, I have all my Rust and C code in individual Git repository. So every time I make a change to code, I commit that and then commit it into the repository as well.
Right. And actually, some of our authors also have an automated set of cherry pick tools that they use with that. So they'll have a Git repo, which represents each of the steps in an example they're building. And if they discover they need to make a change to one of the early steps, they make that change, and then they can make it ripple through all the later changes automatically, which is kind of cool.
So I'm presuming your distributors for the book and partners will also have a copy of this toolchain, or do they get a slightly different one?
Nope, we send them the result. So as an author, when you build you get a kind of lightweight copy of the PDF or the ePub. When it's time for production, we take your book and we move it across to a protected section of the repository. And at that point, we get to use the kind of production version of the tools, which, to be honest with you, are about 90% the same. The difference is that we don't resample images, we normalize stuff. We also make sure that all the color has been removed and we convert everything to black and white, which, to be honest with you, if you actually had a look at one of the PDFs we send off to the printer, you would probably raise your nose at it. They look pretty ugly. They're a lot darker than you'd expect, for example. And that's simply because of the way the printing process works. It's taken us a long time to fine-tune that, but you have to manipulate things quite a bit to get it to work. And also, we have to send it off at a way, way higher resolution than we use for screen reading.
Do you use any or have any plans to use any AI tools, for example, for things like fact-checking, locating references for unreferenced content, checking that external references are properly used, i.e. links, or assessing content, in the editing process for things like structure, clarity?
So, yeah, the first whatever, up until the thing where you said assessing content, we actually do that already, and we've done that for a long time. As part of the production process, we actually go through and validate all external links. And as part of any build, we actually validate all the internal links, and authors will get told if their links are invalid. We also validate things like, since the accessibility is important, we do things like make sure that all of your images have alt tags to describe them and this kind of stuff. So all that kind of stuff is done. But on the AI front, here's the thing. We have a rule that you cannot use AI to write the content. So as an author, feel free to use AI as a research tool or as a sounding board or as whatever you want. But we actually run AI checkers on the books that were given by an author just to make sure that it does not have AI-generated content. And the reason for that is that we think the value we bring in the AI age is that our books don't hallucinate. Right? Our books are the result of a human being giving it their best. And so we don't want our authors to be using AI to generate content. Now, at the same time, we do have something we released fairly recently, a couple of months ago, called the Pragmatic Assistant. And that is a ChatGPT project that has been trained on probably about 40 separate pieces of documents and memos and all sorts of stuff about what it means to be a bookshelf book. So it has all of our writing style guidelines, markup information, all that kind of stuff. And we encourage authors to use that, particularly when they're starting out, because we have a style, we have a voice that we like people to use. And if you've never written long form before, it can be quite tricky to get that right. And so in the old days, that used to be what the development editor would do. You would submit your book and the development editor would go, oh, no, not like that. Now you can basically cut and paste a chapter, a paragraph or something into the AI. It'll come back and say, you really shouldn't use the passive voice here. That should be second person, not first person. Or actually, it would probably just say, don't use I, use we or you here and this kind of stuff. And so we're still refining that, but we're finding authors are quite liking that as a kind of angel on their shoulder kind of AI.
Yeah, I've used that myself when I had to prepare the audience statement for
the
first round of submission. Opened up the ChatGPT Pragmatic Programmer agent, I think it was Java or something. Paste in what I'd written and it went, oh, no.
Yeah.
I know how to do this. And he rolled up his sleeves and went, no, this is how it should look. And I was like, but that doesn't sound like me.
Yeah, that's the thing is, it's not like, we're not handing control over to an AI. It's purely, I use it all the time as a kind of, I don't know about you, but I always find I get my best ideas by describing them out loud.
Yeah, the rubber ducky.
The rubber ducking, right. And an AI is a fantastic rubber duck. One of the cool things we discovered about this is, that ChatGPT, right? It always starts off by saying, what a wonderful human being you are, right? That was really, really good, Dave. And we discovered that people didn't like that, right? If they submitted a section to be critiqued, they didn't want it to come back and say, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed reading that. And then the next sentence says, but of course it was rubbish, And it took us a long time to work out how to tell it not to be artificially encouraging. And I think we've kind of got that under control now. And the response I get from the authors is that's so much better, that they actually all they get back is what they wanted, which is a critique of what they did.
That's cool. I look forward to using more of those as they come out.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us on to the last part of the show. I don't think we're going to have as long as planned, but I think we've covered off maybe half of it. So this last bit was going to be about your CI and CD pipelines. But we had a good history lesson about that, and we now understand that authors can do it locally anytime they want. The distributors and printers don't run it themselves, which I was under the impression they did. So they get a different version.
Yeah, they get the final product.
But just to sort of step back and summarize that process again quickly, when an author wishes to read a PDF or an ePub version of their work in progress, what happens on your infrastructure when they commit and push a change to a Markdown file, now that we know it's Markdown?
So, like you say, we have a build machine, a build environment called Bob for obvious reasons. And if you're an author, whenever you commit a change...
Build Our Books? Does that stand for
it? Is. It is.
That's a good guess.
Very good. Very good. So, yeah, whenever you make a commit, Bob gets notified, and Bob has a queue of books waiting to get built. So Bob will build your book and stick can't remember if it's just the PDF, but it will build it, stick the resulting PDF up on a cloud drive somewhere, and record the log of the build. And then as an author, you get access to our backend system called creators.pragprog.com. And one of the things that does is let you access the build log, and you can see the status of your particular book build and download both the logs and also the PDF version. And one of the benefits of being an author is you actually get to see every other book as well. And so if you're kind of like vaguely interested in some other topic, you can download that and have a look to see what that looks like too.
Yeah, I do that. I have a quick glance. I noticed simplicity wasn't in that build queue though.
Yeah, well, actually, once a book is finished, we take it out of the build,
I see.
Typically, simply because otherwise it gets to, we've got I think we've had about 700 titles now. And so that would be quite a long list. So yeah, typically that's works in progress. But if you want to get a copy, all you have to do is just tell your editor or write into us and we'll get you a copy. Because yeah, authors get access to everything.
So Bob picks that up, just to look back. And is it the same types of errors that can occur that you would locally, or is it different?
No, it's exactly. There's really only ever one process until it gets into production. So the thing that you could run locally is exactly what Bob runs as well.
Okay. And is Bob good at spelling or grammar checking, or is that part of the pipeline?
No, our tools don't do that. We experimented with it, and to be honest, it was just too much of a pain. It's a lot easier because to be honest with you, the vocabulary that we use in our books is not in most dictionaries. And grammar checkers and spelling checkers aren't that happy with technical content. I don't know if you ever tried turning a grammar checker on, but a lot of the times we use nouns as verbs and this kind of thing. And they just go, it's all red squiggles if you...
Yeah, I use JetBrains' Rust Rover IDE for writing my code and the Markdown. And it's forever trying to correct stuff.
Yeah.
And I have to be really conscious of what you said in the last section, because Copilot, or whatever it's called, ChatGPT, is there, always looking to complete my code line or my sentence. So I have to either switch it off, disconnect from the internet, or click escape. So it's not trying to just random stuff on my page. Sometimes it's helpful, it might be just follow this next line or something, which is what I would have said anyway, but got to really be conscious that is my voice, and not.
And that's the really important thing. Yeah. Your voice and your experience, because the other thing I find is if I leave, say, Copilot running, and if I get lazy and start accepting what it does, it's not just that it replaces the next sentence, but it kind of guides you in a particular direction because it has this picture in its model of where you want to go. and it may not be where you want to go. And so if you just sit there and hit tab the whole time and accept what it's saying, you'll end up with a very, very different chapter to the one you intended to write.
The IDE seem to re-reference other stuff in that document.
Oh, yeah.
Other tabs you've got open, and then it just becomes a mess.
It's really interesting. Our editors, about half of them can spot AI-generated content just like without even breathing. They just like say, oh, that look. And you ask them how they do it, and they'll say things like that. They'll say, you can spot that there's too many references or something like that. Personally, I can't do it. I'm kind of AI blind that way. But yeah, they can do that. So I'm with you. I actually turn all the AI assistants off when I'm writing text because I just found it was too distracting. It would actually slow me down.
Yeah, I put music in my ears as well. So I guess it just depends. So I've got a question next about self-links within the book, which we've covered in the previous section. But one thing I haven't asked you about is, do you require like multi-passes? So say, for example, I've linked to page 50 and we're on page 10. Does that just go in like a lookup table type thing and then you check it at the end, or how does that work?
That is a very good question. In early versions of the tool chain, we actually had to make multiple passes. And that actually turned out to be really, really difficult. We actually had some pathological books where if you say it said, as you can see on page whatever, right? And if that page number was 2 characters, 99, then the line would break in a certain way and the rest of the book would format through in that according to that. If the page number changed to 100, then that would change the pagination of the book. And that potentially would then change the page number 100. And it could change it back to 99. And then the 99 would then change it back to 100. And it would just loop forever, changing these page numbers back and forth. So we don't do that. Instead, what happens is cross-references get, like you say, they get built up effectively into a table, and then they're plugged in towards the end. And the formatting then basically adjusts based on that. So there are still pathological cases, but it's all handled internally. That is a joy.
Yeah, because I did it myself when you're free to address anything. And if it doesn't see it, it says in the PDF or the eBook, this reference is something I don't know about yet. I can't find it, and I like that. Yeah,
that actually is, I kind of do that a lot. The idea is that if you're writing something and you want to talk about this, but you haven't got around to it yet. If you put in a cross-reference to the section and it doesn't exist, then the book will still build, but it will build with a warning to say you don't have this. So you can basically use it almost like a to-do mechanism.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So the next couple of things before we wrap up. So writing a Markdown, traditionally, if that's even a word you can use for Markdown and things, you might have a split view where as you're writing, you see it render. So you see your headings and subheadings. Is that something that an author has to be conscious of when they're doing it? And what happens if it's not the way they want it to be? I guess they just build a PDF and look.
First of all, the way Markdown renders into like an editor buffer will not look like the book anyway, because, for example, the width of the window will change how many lines there are in this paragraph and this kind of stuff, because the editor is going to show you the flowable version of the content, not the fixed version. And honestly, we really don't want people to be thinking about what it looks like at that level, right? I think writing is hard enough without also trying to do layout at the same time. So my strong recommendation has always been put blinders on and just write. Don't even think about how it's going to look. Just write. And then let our people, obviously as an author, you can go through and then make things look the way you want them to look. But our people are really good at then taking that last mile or kilometer and making things look really nice. Yeah, I every now and then will run a preview pane on the Markdown. I'm not 100% sure I know why I do it. It kind of just gives me a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling that, yes, I'm achieving something. But it really isn't that useful.
So the last quick couple of questions that I'm going to sneak in. Do you handle indexes in this build system?
Yeah, well, we have index markup that we don't tell authors about. It's just a set of tags that the indexer adds. So when you finish the book as an author, you submit it off to our production process. And one of the first things that happens is it goes to the indexer. And the indexer goes through and adds a really large number of tags to your book. And it does that in line. We are one of the few people in the industry that does that. Most of the time, indexers use a separate application, and they're given a book that has all of the stuff organized into pages and has page numbers. And they will actually literally type in, the name, the content, and the page number on which it occurs into their own indexing program. And after they finish going through the whole book, their indexing program then kicks out the index. And of course, that's great until you then go and add content to the book in the second printing, and it changes the page numbers. So we don't do that. You mark up the same text that the author is working on with these index tags. And then as part of the build process, it automatically collates those and creates the index at the end.
So when you get to handle change history or things like that, are all those tags there? And you just have to be conscious of that, or?
Yeah, that is a downside. The indexes are, in the old days, they used to be like, I'm going to index this word. And so they would add it right in the middle of a paragraph. And now we tell them, if the paragraph's not too long, stick it at the beginning of the paragraph. And that way it doesn't interfere with the reading for the rest of the paragraph. But the benefits of doing it that way, I think, far outweigh the ugliness that it includes in the document.
It sounds like there's humans in the loop for the whole book process.
Oh, absolutely. You have your development editor who's basically doing the daily, keeping an eye on what's going on. Then after you submit, it goes through a number of internal reviews here. It goes out to an external copy editor, an external indexer, and then it goes back to the author one or two times. It then goes to an external layout person. Another person does the cover, and then it all comes together. It goes off to the printer. Yeah, it's very much a high-touch process.
Before it gets to that final stage, how does the feedback work between all the different editors and the author? Does that stay within the document, or is it email, or how does that?
It's both. We have markup. I'm sure you've encountered it, where an editor can insert tags, the editor tag, and an author, or ed, and an author can insert tags. And these are basically like call-outs that you can put in your text. So if you wanted to ask your editor a question, you could say, should I say it this way or that way? And you put that into a tag in the book. And then when the editor builds the book, those tags are highlighted both in the book itself that's produced, but also during the build process. They see a list of questions that you sent come out during the build. And then they can answer those however they see fit. But quite often they'll answer those by putting those tags back in the book. And the copy editor does the same thing. So the copy editor mostly works autonomously. We've experimented with having them do basically just put questions in and then have the author make the changes. 99% of the time, the copy editor is right. So instead, what we do is we say to them, if it's just obviously like bad grammar or something, just fix it. And if it's something you don't know or don't understand or are suspicious about, then add one of your copy edit tags to the text at this point. And then as an author, when you get the book back, it will have these copy editor questions in it. And one of your jobs is to go through and basically remove those and fix whatever it was they were pointing at.
We've got the sort of build chain, CI/CD, and Bob that actually make a digital book, as it were, but then the people make the proper book.
Basically, yeah. I mean, we still use that build chain to actually create, the mechanics of it. But yeah, it's not something currently that you can automate. Even the layout, surprisingly, there's a lot of aesthetic and experience that goes into it.
Perfect. Well, I think we need to wrap up now. Like I said at the beginning, as an upcoming author, I could chat to you forever about this stuff, but you've got to kind of keep it contained.
At some point, we will be chatting with you about your experience because we try to, keep constantly updating it and making it either better or cooler.
Yeah, one of the sad things I hit was when I was told to stop writing because my editor was reading it all. I was like, what am I going to do now? For like a year, I've been doing this every day. But anyway.
It is one of those things where either you hate it or it becomes, you'd be amazed how many people come to us, wanting to write a book and then have written 3 or 4.
I've got a couple up my sleeve.
There you go.
The Express ones mainly, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, and that's actually, it's interesting. So our Express books are shorter, and they have a slightly different style to them. They're not as narrative as our longer books. And I think as the generations change and as people's attention span changes, we have been going more and more to these shorter books, and they are the ones that are popular. Well, that's not true. They are increasingly popular. So yeah, and they're easier to write. So I think a couple of Express books would be a very nice next step.
Well, hopefully this chat we've had brings some new blood to the company.
Yeah, and I just want to say it's not, honestly, we've talked about the technology behind it, right? But writing a book is not about the tech. Writing a book is about somebody having something they are just bursting to say, And to be honest with you, the tech that you use is secondary to just wanting to get that out. I find if I really want to understand something, the best way to do it is to write a book about it, because that way you have to be sure you understand it, and you'll find yourself writing like, but obviously, hang on, why is that obvious? And you go and do some research and everything else. It's not a technical process, is all I'm trying to say. And so we try to write a tool chain that kind of gets out your way and just lets you get on with the fun part, the writing part.
Well, I'm really glad we did this show. This isn't our usual type of thing, but something I found fascinating as an upcoming author. So how can people get in touch and reach out?
Pragprog.com. Over the next couple of months, we will be launching a new website. But even on the existing website, there's a section which is, I think it's called Write With Us or Publish With Us, which has got lots of resources and contact information and everything else.
Excellent. And I've also got your articles on pragdave.me website.
True.
Linked in here, and a link to your new book as well on the Prag website.
I appreciate that. You could also link to my Substack, which is articles.pragdave.me.
Well, Dave, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure. This is Gavin Henry for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.